Hello, crafty friends. This is Jack Burchell, and today I'd like to talk about some of my philosophies of mold making. Now, this is a plate of various components that I've made that I'm planning on making a very simple mold with. Now, I haven't walled it off yet, but ultimately, I'll build up a little half-inch or three-quarter-inch tall wall that will contain the silicone once I pour it in. Now, this is the simplest kind of mold that you can make. It's essentially this. This is a mold that I picked up at Michael's. It's basically a single piece of silicone that you can pour some material into, and it'll make the negative shape. And I have another one of rocks. So I'm going to turn this into a mold like that. I also have some gears here that have been mounted to a piece of melamine. And these are pretty easy to make molds, and I'll be able to make hundreds of gears out of this mold when it's all done. But what I really want to talk about is a little bit more complicated molds. Now, this here is a mold that I just completed today, which has the part that I've made, this little silver ring with the screws in it. This is actually going to be an eyepiece for masks. And I want to be able to reproduce it, and I want to be able to make a mold that is going to be really durable and long-lasting. So I'm going to use a platinum cured silicone. And then this clay here is a sulfur-free clay because sulfur reacts badly with silicone. And I've built everything that I want. I've got the walls here. This little area in the center won't get any silicone. I want to talk about my decisions about how I approach making a mold, because I think that one of the things that confuses people the most when they're making molds is how do you go about making a mold that is really effective. And this is going to be a two-part mold, of course. The clay represents the second pour of silicone that I'm going to do. So let me explain the process. First, I spend a whole bunch of time. This is the most time-consuming part of the process. I embed my part partly in clay, and I want the clay to be at the midpoint, the flashing seam where the mold will ultimately separate. So I've sculpted in these little mold keys. That's just done with a tool like this. And I just, gently press into the clay to create my little mold keys. These will lock in place, so the mold can never be out of register. You know that it's correctly assembled because the mold keys all fit together perfectly. I also have this, you might notice this little channel all the way around. That's a leak guard. I've set this mold up so that I have a pour spout here, and I've got these vents on the side. So the mold is going to be oriented like this when it's complete. And so I want to make sure that if the plastic or the resin escapes the flashing, if this isn't a tight enough seal, it still has to kind of get around all this. So this leak guard helps a lot. Keeps the mold from spilling all over the inside of my pressure pot. So, and I'll explain pressure pots in a future video. The theory here is that this is the pour spout, and I need to have a place for air to release. So I have these sprues here on the side that will ultimately be hollow in the final mold. And so as the material pours down here, it'll kind of pour down around to the bottom, and air will escape here so it doesn't bubble out of the pour spout. And as it fills up past here, then it'll escape here. And I'll know that the mold is filled when I see plastic sort of ooze out of the two air holes on the side. And of course, this thing will be inside a pressure pot, which will help push all the little air bubbles out of it. and make sure that the final part that I want comes out really tidy and neat and clean. The other thing that you'll see in here is I've cut this little channel in the side of my clay. And that's because I'm going to have a mother mold. A mother mold is a piece of, in this case, I'm going to use plaster that fits over the silicone. So once I've poured this silicone in here, I'll remove all this clay wall, and then I'll make another part around the outside of it, which is basically a plaster jacket, which will hold the silicone in a really tidy way. Once I have poured the silicone, I'll also remove this piece of pipe so that the plaster will fill that little area inside. So the plaster will essentially give the silicone form, since, as you can see, the silicone by itself is kind of floppy. This makes sure that it's still flexible, but it's maintained in a relatively rigid position during the curing process of the plastic. So this is still not an incredibly complex mold. So I want to show you this other one that I'm working on, which is a lot more complex. And I want to talk about the theories behind it. So these are a whole bunch of parts that I've made, and not all of them I've made. These are store-bought parts. They're automotive grease gun injectors. This, and this are lamp turns, as well as this. But I have made these little wheels and these screens from scratch. They're just made out of styrene, and I've painted them brass color. And then this is a watch part, which I'll ultimately end up using in a variety of ways. So few of the things that you can see is I've done quite a lot of work to build in all my vents. So these thicker dowels here are all pour spouts. And in an ideal world, I'll only have to pour in one, and I'll see the plastic kind of fall down to the bottom of everything and then fill up from the bottom and then show up in all of the air holes and start weeping out. So I'll know that the part is done and ready to go, especially once I've put it into the pressure pot. So what's the theory behind the way I've aligned this mold? Because you can see there's kind of a lot of complex things. How come I have these things hanging upside down? Why do I have these things here on the bottom with all this networked aluminum wire that I've used that will ultimately be the sprue? Well, I always want the plastic to drive the air out of the mold like a bulldozer. I have these lumps around here. You can see wherever I have a round edge, I don't want to have my flashing line split these right down the middle. I don't want to have to clean that off. And so I have my flashing line just kind of fall on one edge. Once I've poured the silicone in here, then I'll have flipped the mold and I'll remove all the clay and I'll release that silicone and I'll pour the other side. So this clay all represents the second part of the silicone, which I'll pour later. For now, it's just kind of all preset, so it shapes the first pour of silicone. You can see by the wall depth how far I'll pour it. You can also see how I attach the wall. This is also another piece of just melamine plywood, 1/4-inch plywood. I think it's 8mm plywood, or 6mm plywood. I've just built all the clay up on top of that. So this clay also represents the thickness of the final silicone. One of the things I'm trying to do is not use a ton of silicone if I can help it, because platinum cured silicone is expensive. It's about $200 a gallon. So I'm trying to use it very sparingly if I can. So again, talking about when I'm pouring the plastic in, I want the plastic to pour in here and the air to be driven out in front of it. As it pours down, it'll fall down these little channels, and gravity will be my friend. It'll kind of fill up all these big, heavy pieces at the bottom and push plastic ahead of it. You know, as I pour in all these larger tubes, it'll kind of drive plastic ahead of it like a bulldozer blade and push all of the air out and then fill from the bottom up to the top. So that's the reason I've chosen to have these things in sort of these Y formations, because I'm thinking about the path of the plastic. Now, it's a little tricky down here because these are all very tiny, and so I will have to pour into all 5 of these pour spouts in order to get enough plastic down into the bottom. And then, hopefully it drives back up to the top pretty well. Of course, this is all theoretical until I make the mold. Now, I can always come back. I have a cutting loop that I use, and sometimes I add other vent holes. Like if I find that these little nubs here end up with air bubbles, I may cut through the silicone in a little Y shape to just add another little bit of spruing there. Basically, I can cut a little semicircular channel that will relieve air bubbles. And I expect there will be a little bit of that. So all my little registration keys, I haven't totally closed off my avenues for cutting new vent channels, even though it does look fairly dense. So those are the basics of how I approach making a silicone mold, and I hope to do a future video that will show the result of this. I'll show the pour, and then I'll show the result of the other side of the pour. And then finally, a few cured pieces that I make from the final piece. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to update you in future videos.